My name is Elena. I'm in my late 30s now, and for most of my adult life, I was a wife before I was anything else. If you had asked people who knew us, they would have described our marriage as stable, quiet, functional, the kind of relationship that doesn't raise alarms or invite questions. I was often described as patient, understanding, the calm one, the kind of woman who keeps things together without making it look hard. And maybe that's why no one noticed what was slowly disappearing. In my marriage, I wasn't underestimated because I lacked intelligence or strength. I was underestimated because I made endurance look effortless, because I didn't fight loudly, because I didn't threaten to leave, because I believed for a long time that commitment meant staying steady even when something felt off. This story is not about betrayal in the obvious sense. There was no single explosive event, no dramatic confession, no clear villain. Instead, it's about what happens when a marriage slowly reshapes one person into a role they never agreed to, but gradually accepted. My husband believed I would never leave, not because he said it, but because everything in our dynamic reinforced that belief. I adapted, I accommodated, I softened my needs so the marriage could stay intact. From the outside, it probably looked like maturity, like compromise, like love. But inside, something quieter and more dangerous was forming. What you're about to hear is not a story of confrontation or emotional warfare. There were no screaming matches, no ultimatums, no moment where I packed a bag in the middle of the night. Instead, there was a long season of silence, first unconscious, then intentional. A silence where I listened more than I spoke, where I began to understand the invisible power structures inside marriage, where I realized how easily stability can be mistaken for permanence. This is a story about marriage, but not the romantic version. It's about emotional imbalance, about how one partner slowly becomes essential but unseen, how being the reliable one can quietly erase your right to be considered. And what happens when the assumption she'll always be here goes unexamined for too long? I'm sharing this not to assign blame and not to rewrite the past with bitterness. I stayed for reasons that made sense at the time. Love was one of them. Fear was another. Hope played a role too. But this is also a story about leaving, not in anger, not in chaos, but with clarity. About choosing yourself without destroying someone else. About understanding that marriage should never require you to disappear in order to survive it. As you listen, you won't hear a perfect wife or a cruel husband. You'll hear two people living inside a system they never fully questioned, until one of them did. I didn't leave to punish. I left because I finally understood that staying silent forever would cost me more than leaving ever could. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something gently and without judgment. Have you ever been so committed in a marriage that the other person stopped believing you had a breaking point? In our marriage, I was known as the easy one. That wasn't a title anyone gave me out loud, but it lived in the way decisions were made, in the way plans moved forward without much discussion, in the subtle assumption that I would adjust, adapt, or simply make things work. If something needed smoothing over, I did it. If something needed patience, I supplied it. If something was uncomfortable to talk about, I carried it quietly so the house could stay calm. I didn't see this as a problem at first. I saw it as love. I was the wife who remembered details, appointments, birthdays, deadlines, preferences. I anticipated needs before they were spoken. I filled in gaps before they became visible. When tensions arose, I softened my tone. When my husband was stressed, I gave space. When he was distant, I told myself it was temporary. To him, I was dependable, solid, predictable in the best way. I didn't complicate things. I didn't escalate. I didn't demand emotional processing when he was tired. I was the emotional infrastructure of our marriage, present, essential, and mostly unnoticed, unless something went wrong. And because I carried that role so quietly, it became invisible even to me. If someone had asked my husband who I was, he would have said I was strong. He would have said I handled things well. He would have said he didn't worry about me, and he would have meant all of it as a compliment. But what those words really meant was this: he never imagined I would reach a limit. I didn't complain much, not because everything was fine, but because I didn't trust my discomfort to be received with care. I learned early that emotional conversations made him defensive or withdrawn, so I edited myself. I brought things up gently, carefully, and when the response was indifference or fatigue, I told myself timing mattered. That marriage was about choosing your battles. So I chose silence more often than not. Over time, that silence shaped how I was seen. I became the wife who didn't need reassurance, the wife who didn't need to be checked in on, the wife whose presence could be assumed. I was always there, so my absence never crossed anyone's mind. And I want to be clear, this wasn't cruelty. It was comfort, familiarity, the kind that slowly blurs appreciation into expectation. In social settings, this dynamic followed us. He spoke more. I listened. He told stories. I filled in facts when needed. People laughed at his jokes, and I smiled along, proud to support him. If someone needed something organized, I handled it quietly. If there was emotional tension, I diffused it. I was seen as supportive, low maintenance, the kind of wife other people described as understanding. But understanding, when it only moves in one direction, becomes a form of erasure. Inside the marriage, my emotional world became small, not because I lacked depth, but because there was no space for it. I learned which parts of myself fit and which parts created friction. I kept the ones that fit. I folded the rest away, telling myself this was maturity, that this was what long marriages required. I didn't feel oppressed, I felt optional. And that's the most dangerous place to be in a marriage. Not unloved, not mistreated, just quietly taken for granted. I want to emphasize this again. I don't tell this part of the story with resentment. I wasn't a victim trapped by force. I participated in this dynamic because it felt safer than risking disruption. Being the steady one gave me a sense of worth, because leaving or even threatening to felt unthinkable at the time. But while everyone else saw me as stable, accommodating, unshakable, something else was forming beneath the surface. I was watching. I was noticing patterns. I was remembering moments that were brushed aside too quickly. And even though I didn't yet have language for it, I was beginning to understand the role I had been assigned and how little room it left for me to be fully human. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with clarity. I can still point to the moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was quiet enough to slip past everyone else. It happened on an ordinary evening. No argument, no raised voices, just a conversation that drifted into a decision already made. We were sitting at the table, talking about something small, plans for the coming months. He mentioned a commitment he had agreed to, one that would affect both of us. Time, money, priorities. He said it casually, almost in passing, as if it were already settled. I remember pausing, not in shock, not in anger, just pausing, because he hadn't asked. Not once, not earlier, not now. There was no, "What do you think?" or "Does that work for you?" There was an assumption embedded so deeply in his tone that he didn't even seem aware of it. The assumption that I would adjust, that I always did. I nodded. I said something neutral. I told myself it wasn't worth turning into a discussion. It wasn't a big decision after all. And marriages are full of small compromises, right? But something inside me registered it differently. Not as a mistake, but as information. I noticed how easily my role had been removed from the process, how natural it felt for him to decide first and inform me later, and how quickly I silenced my own discomfort to keep the moment smooth. If anyone else had been there, they wouldn't have seen anything wrong. If I had told a friend, I would have minimized it myself. "It's nothing," I would have said. "He didn't mean it like that." And all of that would have been true. But intention doesn't erase impact. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, not replaying the conversation obsessively, but sitting with a faint sense of imbalance. a feeling that something had shifted slightly off center, as a picture frame tilted just enough to bother you once you notice it. I didn't confront him. I didn't store it as ammunition. I simply remembered, and that was new for me. Before, I had a habit of smoothing things over so completely that they disappeared even from my own memory. This time, I didn't do that. I let the moment exist without fixing it, without reframing it into something more comfortable. I began to notice how often decisions were framed as done deals. How often was my agreement assumed rather than requested? How my calm responses trained the marriage to move forward without my explicit consent. Still, I said nothing, because one small cut doesn't bleed. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't justify alarm. It just leaves a mark that only you can see. I told myself this was normal, that long-term marriage creates shortcuts, that trust allows efficiency, that not every decision needs a conversation. And again, none of that was wrong. But what unsettled me wasn't the decision itself. It was how invisible I felt in the process. I realized something else that night, something uncomfortable. If I had made a similar decision without consulting him, I would have apologized. I would have explained myself. I would have worried about how it affected him. That difference stayed with me, not as resentment, but as awareness. From that moment on, I started paying attention to the smallest interactions, the moments most people forget by morning, the tone, the timing, the assumptions tucked into everyday exchanges. I wasn't looking for flaws. I wasn't building a case. I was simply no longer erasing my own reactions to keep the peace. That first small cut didn't hurt because it was cruel. It hurt because it revealed something true. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. After the first small cut, nothing changed on the surface. That's the part people don't talk about. There was no immediate fallout, no tension, no apology needed. Life continued exactly as it had before, and that's how the pattern was allowed to grow. The moments repeated themselves in new forms, decisions shared after the fact, opinions acknowledged but not integrated, conversations that ended with a polite nod and no adjustment, each time subtle enough to dismiss, each time easy to rationalize. And I did rationalize them. I told myself he was busy, that stress narrowed his focus, that I was more emotionally resilient, so it made sense for me to carry more. I reminded myself that marriage wasn't a scoreboard, that love meant flexibility, that keeping things calm was a virtue. Silence became my default, not because I was afraid of conflict, but because I was skilled at minimizing myself. I learned to present my needs as optional suggestions. I softened my language so much that it lost its weight. "It's not a big deal" became my most used phrase. Not because it was true, but because it ended conversations quickly. Over time, those patterns settled into something familiar. He didn't dismiss me openly. He didn't insult or belittle me. Instead, my presence was filtered through convenience. If something aligned with his plans, it moved forward. If it didn't, it stalled or dissolved quietly. And because I didn't push, it appeared mutual. I started noticing how often my emotional responses were met with practical solutions instead of curiosity, how quickly conversation shifted back to his concerns, how rarely I was asked follow-up questions. Again, nothing overt, nothing dramatic, just a slow erosion of mutuality. And the most uncomfortable part, I participated in it. Every time I chose peace over honesty, every time I told myself, this isn't worth it. Every time I swallowed a reaction, it felt too heavy for the moment. I was teaching him something without realizing it, that my discomfort was negotiable and his wasn't. I wasn't lying when I said I was fine. I was just postponing the truth. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being physically close to someone who no longer fully sees you. Not because they don't care, but because the version of you they interact with has been carefully edited for ease. I became that edited version. Friends saw us as solid, family praised our stability. I was proud of how drama-free our marriage was, but inside I felt increasingly unanchored. Not unhappy, just undefined. I stopped bringing certain thoughts into the relationship altogether. Not because they were wrong, but because they didn't fit the rhythm anymore. It felt easier to carry them alone than to risk disrupting the equilibrium. And that's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition. Through moments small enough to dismiss individually, but powerful enough to reshape the dynamic when combined. By the time I noticed how quiet I had become, it felt too late to suddenly be loud. So I stayed consistent, supportive, reasonable, and I told myself this was what commitment looked like. It took me a long time to understand that roles in a marriage don't always come from conversations. Sometimes they form quietly, through repetition, convenience, and what no one challenges. By the time I became aware of mine, it was already fully established. I was the reliable one. Not just dependable in the practical sense, but emotionally predictable. I didn't surprise anyone. I didn't derail plans. I didn't introduce complexity where simplicity was preferred. If something needed to be handled, I handled it. If something went wrong, I absorbed the impact without complaint. My husband didn't ask me to become this version of myself. He simply responded well to it. And I, wanting harmony more than recognition, reinforced it. In this role, I was useful. I made life easier. I anticipated stress and eliminated it before it surfaced. I remembered things so he didn't have to. I managed the emotional undercurrent of our marriage while he focused on the visible structure. I was the one who noticed when something felt off, even if I didn't say it out loud. Usefulness has a quiet way of replacing intimacy if you're not careful. Because when someone becomes essential to the functioning of a life, they're often no longer seen as someone who needs care themselves. I wasn't fragile, I wasn't dramatic, I was fine. And so I became invisible, not absent, but unseen. There were moments when I tried to step outside the role, when I hinted at exhaustion, when I expressed uncertainty or dissatisfaction. But because those moments didn't align with the version of me everyone had come to expect, they were gently dismissed. You're just tired. You're overthinking it. Things are good, aren't they? None of these responses was meant to silence me, but they did. I learned that if I wanted to be heard, I would have to break character. And breaking character felt dangerous. Because once you're the strong one, your weakness becomes inconvenient. So I stayed in the role. I told myself it was temporary, that things would rebalance on their own, that every marriage has seasons where one partner carries more. And again, those thoughts weren't wrong. But what I didn't realize was that the role wasn't seasonal anymore. It was permanent. My husband relied on my steadiness the way you rely on gravity, never thinking about it, never questioning it, never imagining it could disappear. And why would he? I had never given him a reason to. That's the paradox of quiet endurance. The better you are at it, the less likely anyone is to notice the cost. Inside, I began to feel strangely replaceable and irreplaceable at the same time. Essential to the structure, but not central to the emotional exchange. I was needed, but not deeply considered. And something in me started to resist that. Not with anger, not with rebellion, with awareness. I began to see how the role limited me, how it shaped every interaction. It defined what I was allowed to need. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I had avoided for years. If I stopped performing this role, what would be left? I didn't answer it yet, but I didn't forget it either. The shift didn't happen during a fight. There was no argument, no accusation, no breaking point that anyone else could point to and say, that's when everything changed. It happened on a morning that looked exactly like all the others. We were standing in the kitchen. He was talking about his day, plans, deadlines, something he needed to handle. I was listening, half present, performing the familiar rhythm of nods and soft responses. At one point, he paused, waiting for affirmation, and without thinking, I gave it. Yes, that makes sense. The words left my mouth automatically, and then something inside me went still. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was the sudden, unmistakable awareness that my response had nothing to do with how I actually felt. I wasn't agreeing because I believed in what he was saying. I was agreeing because agreement kept things moving. That moment, so small it could have disappeared, stayed with me. For the rest of the day, I replayed it, not obsessively, but curiously. I realized how often my reactions were reflexes rather than choices. How much of my presence in the marriage was about maintaining flow rather than expressing truth. That realization was unsettling, not because it made him look bad, but because it made me look unfamiliar to myself. I had become someone who responded instead of someone who participated. That night, I didn't bring anything up. I didn't change my tone. I didn't withdraw affection or create distance. From the outside, nothing shifted, but internally, something very precise clicked into place. I stopped assuming that silence was neutral. I began to see it as a decision, not a flaw, not a weakness, a choice I had been making every day without acknowledging its cost. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. In the weeks that followed, I didn't confront him. I didn't rehearse speeches or prepare ultimatums. I didn't even change my behavior in obvious ways. I simply became more present with myself. I noticed when I wanted to speak and didn't. I noticed when my opinions dissolved before reaching my lips. I noticed how often my first instinct was to minimize. These observations weren't accusations, they were data. And the most surprising part was this. I felt calmer than I had in years. Because clarity does that. It removes the constant low-level tension of not knowing why you feel disconnected. It gives shape to discomfort that used to feel vague and personal. I wasn't suddenly empowered. I was aware. And awareness is quieter than empowerment, but far more dangerous to an unbalanced system. I didn't know where this would lead. I didn't know if it meant change or conversation or eventual separation. I wasn't planning anything yet. But for the first time, I stopped assuming that staying was my only option. That thought didn't scare me. It steadied me. After that internal shift, my silence changed texture. From the outside, nothing looked different. I was still calm, still cooperative, still the version of myself everyone recognized. But inside, silence was no longer automatic. It was intentional. I began to notice the space before I responded. A pause that used to be filled instantly with reassurance or agreement now stayed open just a second longer. Not long enough to be confrontational, just long enough for me to check in with myself. Do I actually agree with this? Do I want to speak right now? Or am I just smoothing things over? Most of the time, I still chose not to speak. But the reason mattered, because when silence is chosen, it stops draining you. It becomes an observation. I listened more carefully, not just to what he said, but to what he didn't ask. I watched how decisions unfolded. I noticed how rarely my inner world was invited into the marriage, and how comfortable that absence had become for him. And because I wasn't reacting emotionally anymore, those patterns became clearer. He mistook my quiet for stability. That's an easy mistake to make when someone has been steady for years, when they don't complain, when they don't threaten, when their presence feels guaranteed. If anything, he seemed more relaxed. There was less friction, fewer moments of emotional negotiation. I was efficient, supportive, calm, and in his mind, I think he believed the marriage was doing well. What he didn't realize was that I had stopped using silence to protect the relationship. I was using it to protect myself. I no longer fill in emotional gaps automatically. If something felt unresolved, I let it remain unresolved. If a topic was brushed aside, I didn't circle back to rescue it. I stopped translating my feelings into something easier to digest, not as punishment, as information. And here's the strange thing. When you stop explaining yourself constantly, people often assume you have less to say. In reality, you're just no longer performing accessibility. I became less predictable emotionally. Not volatile, just unavailable in ways I hadn't been before. I still showed up, I still contributed, but the emotional labor I had been quietly providing began to recede. He didn't notice at first. Why would he? The structure of our life remained intact. The house ran, the routines held, nothing broke. But underneath, the dynamic had shifted. Silence, when chosen deliberately, creates distance. Not physical distance, but psychological space. And in that space, I could finally hear myself think. I wasn't building a case, I wasn't preparing an exit. I was simply no longer handing over my inner clarity for free. And because I didn't announce this change, it looked like nothing had happened. That's the part people misunderstand about quiet dominance. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't look like strength from the outside. It looks like compliance, right up until it isn't. Once silence became intentional, my attention sharpened. Not in a paranoid way, not with suspicion or bitterness, but with the kind of clarity that comes when you stop explaining things away and start seeing them as they are. I began to notice patterns I had previously blurred with empathy. How often decisions flowed in one direction, how frequently my flexibility was treated as a given, how rarely my emotional well-being was considered unless I brought it up, and how quickly it was forgotten afterward. I didn't confront any of it. I started documenting, not on paper at first, but in my mind. I remembered dates. I remembered conversations. I remembered how certain moments made me feel before I talked myself out of those feelings. Memory is a form of leverage when you stop rewriting it to protect others. Eventually, I did begin to write things down. Not accusations, not grievances, just observations. Facts, patterns, a private record of how the marriage actually functioned, not how it was described. At the same time, I started learning. Not about him, but about myself. I paid attention to what I had put on hold over the years. Interests I had minimized. Skills I hadn't developed further because they didn't seem immediately useful to the marriage. Professional opportunities I had deprioritized because they created inconvenience. I didn't make grand changes, I made quiet ones. I updated my knowledge, I sharpened skills. I reconnected with a sense of competence that existed outside my role as a wife, not secretly but subtly, without announcing it as a transformation. I also began to understand the practical structures of our life together, how finances were organized, what was shared and what wasn't, what assumptions were built into our long-term plans. These weren't preparations to leave, at least not consciously. They were preparations to know. Because ignorance keeps you dependent, and I had lived too long inside assumptions I had never verified. From his perspective, nothing had changed. I was still there, still cooperative, still calm. If anything, I seemed less demanding, easier. What he didn't notice was that I had stopped anchoring my identity exclusively to the marriage. I was repositioning internally, not emotionally detaching, but emotionally decentralizing him. There's a difference. I still cared. I still invested. But I was no longer orienting my entire sense of stability around his reactions. And that subtle shift gave me an unexpected sense of strength, not the loud kind, the quiet, grounded kind that doesn't need to prove itself. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt prepared. Prepared for clarity, prepared for truth, prepared for whatever realization came next. And I understood something else then, something crucial. The reason people underestimate quiet women isn't that they lack power. It's because no one sees the moment they stop giving it away. The realization didn't arrive like a victory. There was no rush of adrenaline, no sense of triumph, just a calm, unmistakable clarity that settled in once everything I had been observing finally connected. What I discovered wasn't a secret about him. It was the truth about me. I saw, with uncomfortable precision, how much of the marriage's emotional stability depended on my participation. How many things functioned smoothly, not because they were balanced, but because I absorbed the imbalance quietly. How often I had stepped in to prevent discomfort, misunderstanding, or accountability from surfacing. And when I imagined myself stepping back, not leaving, just withdrawing that invisible labor, I understood something profound. I had leverage. Not because I controlled anything, not because I held information over him, but because I had been holding the system together without it being acknowledged. That kind of leverage doesn't announce itself. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like power until it's no longer there. I realized that the marriage, as it existed, relied on my silence more than my presence. That was the private reveal. And it didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel sober. Because with that knowledge came responsibility. I couldn't unsee it. I couldn't pretend anymore that staying exactly as I was meant nothing. Every choice from that point forward carried weight. I understood that if I spoke honestly, the marriage would have to change or expose itself. And if I didn't speak, I would continue disappearing slowly, politely, forever. There was no dramatic moment where I decided to leave, but there was a moment where I accepted this truth. Staying silent was no longer neutral. It was self-betrayal. I also saw something else, something harder to admit. He wasn't intentionally taking from me. He had simply grown accustomed to a version of marriage that asked very little of him emotionally because I had made it that way. Comfort had replaced curiosity, familiarity had replaced care, and people rarely question systems that work in their favor. That understanding softened something in me. It removed the urge to punish or expose. There was nothing to win here, only something to decide. I didn't rush that decision. I sat with clarity quietly. Let it settle. Let it change how I moved internally. I continued observing, not to gather proof, but to make sure I wasn't imagining things. The patterns held, and with each confirmation, I felt less emotional and more resolved. This wasn't about one argument, one moment, or one flaw. It was about alignment, and I could finally see, without denial or drama, that the marriage was aligned around my endurance, not my presence. That knowledge didn't break my heart. It steadied it. Once the clarity settled in, I stood at a quiet crossroads. Not one that anyone else could see. There were no outward signs, no change in routine, no tension in the air. But internally, I knew I had reached a point where doing nothing was no longer an option. I began to see the paths in front of me with surprising calm. One option was to speak, to finally articulate everything I had been holding, to name the imbalance, to ask for a change, to risk discomfort in the hope that the marriage could be reshaped into something more mutual. Another option was to stay exactly as I was, to accept the role fully, without resistance, to make peace with being the emotional infrastructure rather than an equal participant, to survive but in a reduced version of myself. And then there was the third option, the one I hadn't allowed myself to consider before, to leave. Not in anger, not as a reaction, but as a deliberate, irreversible choice made from clarity rather than pain. I didn't decide quickly. I played out each future in my mind, not romantically, but realistically. If I spoke, would the change be sustained, or would it require constant vigilance from me to maintain? Would I become the difficult one for finally asking to be seen? Would I spend years translating my needs into something manageable for someone who had grown comfortable not asking? If I stayed silent, what would happen to me? 5 years from now? 10? Would I still recognize myself, or would I become someone who lived efficiently but without presence? And if I left, what would that cost? I didn't imagine freedom as excitement. I imagined it as a responsibility, as solitude, as rebuilding, as facing parts of myself I had avoided by staying useful to someone else. But there was one question that cut through all the others. Which choice would require me to keep betraying myself? The answer was immediate. I realized then that the most irreversible decision wasn't leaving. It was continuing to disappear. So I chose the path that couldn't be undone. Not because it was easier, but because it was honest. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't test it in conversation. I didn't threaten it to see if it would produce change. Once I chose it, I protected it by keeping it private. Because some decisions lose their power if they're negotiated too early. From that point on, my actions aligned quietly with my clarity. I wasn't cold, I wasn't distant, I was simply resolved. And resolution has a stillness that looks a lot like calm. Once the decision was made, my life began to shift in ways that were almost invisible. There was no countdown, no secret excitement, no sense of escape, just a quiet, methodical alignment between what I now knew and how I acted. I started with information. I reviewed documents I had never fully examined before, not because they were hidden, but because I had trusted the structure to be fair without understanding it. I familiarized myself with timelines, obligations, and options. I asked neutral questions in neutral contexts. I listened carefully to the answers. Nothing dramatic, just clarity replacing assumption. I adjusted my finances gradually, not in secrecy, but in awareness. I understood what was shared and what was individual. I made sure I could stand on my own if needed, not emotionally, but practically. Independence, I learned, is built long before it's required. I didn't change my behavior at home in ways that would raise concern. I still participated, still contributed, still showed up. But I stopped overextending. I stopped compensating for gaps that weren't mine to fill. That alone created space. Emotionally, I began to detach from outcomes. I no longer measured the health of the marriage by his mood or attention. I stopped monitoring the temperature of the room. If something felt off, I let it be off. This wasn't punishment. It was honesty. From his perspective, nothing was wrong. There was no crisis to respond to, no problem to fix. I was calm, functional, and present. And because I didn't announce my internal shift, there was nothing to notice. That's the advantage of moving in silence. You're not hiding, you're simply no longer performing transparency for comfort. Each step I took was reversible on its own. A conversation, a document, a small adjustment. But together, they formed a path that only went in one direction. I wasn't rushing, I wasn't afraid of being discovered, because I wasn't doing anything wrong. I was just preparing for a life where I no longer relied on being overlooked to survive. There was no guilt in this process. I had given the marriage years of my steadiness without question. Taking time to understand my options felt less like betrayal and more like balance. And the strange thing was, I felt lighter, not excited, not relieved, grounded. Because when your actions finally match your truth, there's no internal conflict to manage. I didn't know when the consequences would begin. I just knew they would. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, almost politely, like something misaligned rather than broken. At first, it showed up as confusion. He noticed that certain things no longer happened automatically. Small comforts, emotional cushioning, the way I used to anticipate and soften before he even realized something was off. Nothing he could point to, nothing he could accuse me of, just an absence he couldn't name. He would pause mid-conversation as if expecting something from me. Agreement, reassurance, adjustment. And when it didn't arrive, he looked momentarily disoriented. Not angry, just unsure of the next step. I didn't fill the space. And that was new. The household still functioned, schedules held, responsibilities were met. But the emotional ease he had grown accustomed to began to thin. He seemed more restless, less settled. Not because I was doing something to him, but because I had stopped doing something for him. And the loss of invisible labor is often felt before it's understood. He began asking small questions. "Are you okay? You seem quiet." I answered honestly, but minimally. "I'm fine. Just thinking." Because I was. I didn't explain what he hadn't noticed for years. I didn't narrate my internal process to make it digestible. I let him experience the shift without translating it. From the outside, it still didn't look like a problem. But internally, the marriage was recalibrating and not in his favor. I also noticed how quickly discomfort made him want to restore the old dynamic, how he sought reassurance without examining what had changed, how the instinct was to return to normal rather than understand why normal no longer existed. That told me everything I needed to know. Because when someone truly sees you, they ask different questions. They don't ask how to fix the feeling. They ask where it came from. The consequences continued quietly. He began to feel less secure, though he couldn't explain why. Plans that once felt solid now felt uncertain. The emotional ground beneath him had shifted, but not violently. Gently. And gentleness can be more destabilizing than force. I didn't feel satisfaction watching this unfold. I felt confirmation. Confirmation that the balance had never been mutual, that my presence had been assumed more than appreciated, that my silence had been part of the structure, and removing it changed everything. Still, I didn't accelerate anything. I let the process reveal itself. Because once a system starts responding to the absence of something it depended on, you don't need to push. It tells the truth on its own. By the time he realized something was truly wrong, the foundation had already shifted. Not cracked, not collapsed, shifted. And that kind of change doesn't respond to urgency. The questions became more frequent, less casual. There was a new tone in his voice. Not fear exactly, but concern edged with uncertainty. He tried to locate the problem as if it were a specific event, a misunderstanding, something that could be corrected with the right conversation. But there was no single moment to point to. That frustrated him, because he was looking for something to fix, and I had already moved past the stage where fixing was possible. He asked if I was unhappy. He asked if something had happened. He asked if he had done something wrong. Each question came from confusion, not reflection. And I answered calmly, I don't know how to explain it. Nothing specific. I've just been thinking. Those answers unsettled him more than anger ever could have, because there was nothing to argue with, nothing to defend against. He began offering solutions, small changes, more attention, more presence, suggestions that came from the assumption that this was a recent problem, a dip, not a reckoning. And that's when I understood something with painful clarity. He was reacting to the effect, not the cause. He wanted to restore the version of the marriage that worked for him, not examine how it had been sustained, not question the role I had been quietly playing for years. There was effort, but it came late. Not too late in time, too late in understanding. I didn't feel anger toward him in those moments. I felt distance, the kind that forms when two people are no longer standing in the same emotional timeline. I had been processing this for months, maybe years. He had just arrived. And when someone shows up late to a conversation you've already finished having with yourself, there's no way to rewind to where they need to begin. He tried to be reassuring, promised things would be different, asked me to tell him what I needed. But I realized then that I didn't want to teach someone how to see me. I wanted to be with someone who already did, or to be alone. That realization wasn't cruel. It was clean. I could see the panic building in him. Not loud, but persistent. A sense that something essential was slipping away without a clear explanation. And I knew that from his perspective, it must have felt sudden. But for me, this moment had been forming for a very long time. Nothing could be reversed. Not because I was unwilling to try, but because the version of myself who could survive that marriage no longer existed. And I wasn't going to recreate her just to make things comfortable again. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no dramatic timing, no audience. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally acknowledging what had already become true. He spoke first. Not defensively, not angrily, just carefully. He said he felt distance. He said he didn't recognize me anymore. He said he was afraid of losing something he couldn't quite name. I listened, really listened. Not with the instinct to respond or reassure, but with the awareness that this was no longer a negotiation. It was an ending being understood out loud. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every moment I had swallowed. I didn't present evidence. I spoke simply. I told him that I had been present for a long time without being fully seen, that I had adapted so well to the marriage that I slowly disappeared inside it, that I no longer trusted the dynamic to change without me becoming someone I didn't want to be again. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I answered honestly. I didn't know how to say it without being dismissed or without dismissing myself. That landed quietly. There was no denial, no attempt to argue facts, just a long pause where the weight of what wasn't said finally became visible. He apologized. I believe he meant it, but apologies repair moments, not patterns. And this pattern had shaped us too deeply. I told him I wasn't angry, that I didn't blame him, that this wasn't about punishment or fault. It was about alignment and how far apart we had become without noticing. He asked if there was anything he could do, and that was the hardest part, because the truthful answer wasn't something he could act on. I've already made my decision. I said it gently, not as a threat, not as a wall, as a fact. The conversation ended without drama, without hostility, without false hope. Just two people acknowledging that love, when unsupported by awareness, can still fail quietly. We didn't touch. We didn't cry. We sat in the truth long enough to recognize it. And that was enough. The conversation happened on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no dramatic timing, no audience. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally acknowledging what had already become true. He spoke first. Not defensively, not angrily, just carefully. He said he felt distance. He said he didn't recognize me anymore. He said he was afraid of losing something he couldn't quite name. I listened, really listened. Not with the instinct to respond or reassure, but with the awareness that this was no longer a negotiation. It was an ending being understood out loud. When it was my turn, I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount every moment I had swallowed. I didn't present evidence. I spoke simply. I told him that I had been present for a long time without being fully seen, that I had adapted so well to the marriage that I slowly disappeared inside it, that I no longer trusted the dynamic to change without me becoming someone I didn't want to be again. He asked why I hadn't said something sooner. I answered honestly. I didn't know how to say it without being dismissed or without dismissing myself. That landed quietly. There was no denial, no attempt to argue facts, just a long pause where the weight of what wasn't said finally became visible. He apologized. I believe he meant it, but apologies repair moments, not patterns. And this pattern had shaped us too deeply. I told him I wasn't angry, that I didn't blame him, that this wasn't about punishment or fault. It was about alignment and how far apart we had become without noticing. He asked if there was anything he could do, and that was the hardest part, because the truthful answer wasn't something he could act on. I've already made my decision. I said it gently. Not as a threat, not as a wall, as a fact. The conversation ended without drama, without hostility, without false hope. Just two people acknowledging that love, when unsupported by awareness, can still fail quietly. We didn't touch. We didn't cry. We sat in the truth long enough to recognize it, and that was enough. After I left, people expected a transformation they could see. A dramatic reinvention, a visible glow-up, anger, relief, celebration, something that would explain the ending in a way that made sense to them. But that's not what happened. What changed wasn't my personality, it was my center. For the first time in years, my internal world and my external life were aligned. There was no role to maintain, no emotional editing required, no quiet labor running in the background to keep someone else comfortable. And the absence of that weight felt spacious, not joyful in the way movies promise, not euphoric, just calm, clean, honest. I learned that I wasn't actually quiet by nature. I had been conserving energy. I wasn't low maintenance. I had been self-limiting. I wasn't endlessly patient. I had been postponing my own presence. Outside the marriage, those traits rearranged themselves into something new. I became more precise with my words, more selective with my availability. I no longer explained my boundaries as if they were temporary inconveniences. I didn't overfunction to earn belonging. And most importantly, I stopped mistaking endurance for love. I didn't leave with bitterness because I finally understood my part in what happened, not as blame, but as responsibility. I had stayed silent longer than I should have because silence felt safer than risking change. That doesn't make me weak. It makes me human. I also didn't leave with hatred for him. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't malicious. He was comfortable. And comfort, when unexamined, can quietly consume another person's presence. Understanding that allowed me to let go without needing him to become a villain. Now, my life is quieter, but in a different way. The silence belongs to me. I fill it with things that don't require me to shrink. Conversations where I'm not translating myself. Work that reflects my competence instead of hiding it. Relationships where being seen isn't something I have to request. I trust myself now. Not because I won anything, but because I listened when something inside me said, "This isn't who you're meant to be anymore." That trust is the real dominance, not over another person, over my own life. This story doesn't end with a lesson meant to make anyone feel superior. It ends with clarity. If there's one thing I've learned, it's this. A marriage doesn't usually fail because of one dramatic betrayal. It fades when one person slowly becomes a function instead of a presence, and no one stops to ask what that costs. Quiet endurance is often praised, especially in marriage. Being understanding, being flexible, being the strong one. But strength without reciprocity turns into disappearance, and commitment without curiosity becomes entitlement, even when no harm is intended. I don't regret loving deeply. I don't regret trying. And I don't regret staying as long as I did. Every version of me made the best decision she could with the awareness she had at the time. But I do believe this: no relationship is worth the steady erosion of your inner voice. Leaving didn't make me brave. Listening to myself did. I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because I realized that staying silent forever would have required me to keep betraying myself, and that cost was too high. If you're listening to this while questioning your own marriage, I won't tell you what to do. Every relationship is complex. Every choice carries weight, but I will say this gently. Pay attention to who you're becoming in the quiet. Not who you are during the good moments, not who you are when things are stable, but who you are when you're consistently accommodating, adjusting, and explaining yourself away. That version of you is trying to tell you something. You don't need drama to justify change. You don't need cruelty to validate leaving. And you don't need permission to stop disappearing. Sometimes the most powerful decision you'll ever make is the one you make calmly, without needing to be seen making it. Before we end, I want to ask you one final question, and I invite you to reflect or share it in the comments if it resonates with you. Have you ever stayed quiet in a relationship so long that you almost forgot what your own voice sounded like? If so, you're not alone.